bringing attention to Lou Gehrig's disease by taking the ALS ice bucket. You have a lot in 40s.
30s, 40s, 50s.
Yeah, so it's not the early write the code and be hands-on, stay up all night.
The fall of Bill Gates. For decades, Bill Gates represented something rare in modern history. A billionaire almost everyone agreed was doing good. He wasn't just wealthy, he was respected. The co-founder of Microsoft, a dropout who changed personal computing forever, a man who pledged to give away nearly all of his fortune to fight disease, poverty, and suffering around the world. World leaders praised him, presidents honored him, the Queen knighted him. Time magazine called him a good Samaritan. For years, Bill Gates was the template for what a responsible billionaire was supposed to look like. Then the pandemic hit. Suddenly, Gates wasn't just a philanthropist, he was everywhere. Warning about viruses, talking about vaccines, speaking with authority on global health. To supporters, he was prepared. To critics, he had too much influence. Conspiracies exploded, trust fractured, and the image that had taken decades to build began to wobble. But what truly cracked it wasn't COVID. It was what surfaced afterward. Private emails, old relationships, and a connection to one of the most notorious criminals of the modern era, Jeffrey Epstein. By the time Bill and Melinda Gates announced the end of their 27-year marriage, the public realized something unsettling. The story they thought they knew was incomplete. Because reputations aren't defined only by public achievements. They're defined by private decisions. And once those decisions come to light, even the most carefully constructed legacy can begin to unravel. For nearly 2 decades, Bill Gates occupied a position few people in history ever reach. He wasn't just the richest man in the world, he was widely admired for what he chose to do with that wealth. After co-founding Microsoft and helping ignite the personal computing revolution, Gates pivoted towards something even more ambitious: reshaping global philanthropy. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he pledged to give away nearly all of his fortune to fight disease, poverty, and inequality on a planetary scale. The world rewarded him for it. He received an honorary knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama. In 2005, Time magazine put him on its cover as one of its Good Samaritans and named him a Person of the Year. For a generation, Bill Gates became the model of the good billionaire. Brilliant, awkward, data-driven, and seemingly obsessed with solving humanity's biggest problems rather than enjoying personal excess. At the center of that image was his marriage. Gates met Melinda French at Microsoft. He was the boss. She was a product manager. At first, she turned him down. He kept asking. Eventually, the relationship became serious. Serious enough that Gates famously made a pros and cons list about whether marriage would interfere with running the company. They married in Hawaii. Melinda left Microsoft 2 years later. Together, they raised 3 children and built a philanthropic empire that rivaled the budgets of some governments. From the outside, it looked stable, disciplined, predictable. Then came the pandemic. For years, Gates had warned that the world was unprepared for a global outbreak. When COVID-19 arrived, those warnings suddenly looked prophetic. Overnight, he was everywhere. Interviews, panels, podcasts, op-eds, speaking about vaccines, global health infrastructure, and the mistakes governments were making. To supporters, he was an informed voice sounding the alarm. To critics, he was something else entirely. They argued he wasn't elected, that he wielded too much influence, that private money was shaping public health decisions. Conspiracy theories spread at astonishing speed, accusing Gates of profiting from vaccines, manipulating populations, or using global health as a tool for control. Most of these claims collapsed under scrutiny, but the damage was real. For the first time, the Gates brand wasn't universally trusted. And then the scrutiny moved from his ideas to his personal life. In 2021, Bill and Melinda Gates shocked the public by announcing they were ending their marriage after 27 years. In a joint statement, they wrote that they no longer believed they could grow together in the next phase of their lives. Shortly after, Melinda stepped away from the foundation entirely. To many observers, the split seemed to come out of nowhere. There had been no public scandals, no tabloid drama, no visible cracks. The couple had spent decades presenting a united front, methodical, controlled, almost corporate in its stability. But behind the scenes, something had been unraveling for years. In interviews following the divorce, Melinda would later suggest the problem wasn't a single incident, but an accumulation. There came a point, she said, where she realized the relationship was no longer healthy and that trust had eroded. That comment raised uncomfortable questions, because around the same time, long-buried reports began resurfacing. In 2019, the Wall Street Journal revealed that Microsoft's board had opened an internal investigation into an alleged affair Gates had with an employee nearly 2 decades earlier. Not long after, Gates stepped down from Microsoft's board. Then came reporting from the New York Times, alleging that Gates had pursued women on multiple occasions, including sending an email to an employee asking her to dinner, adding a line that struck many readers as unsettling. "If this makes you uncomfortable, pretend it never happened." The woman reportedly brushed it off, but the pattern mattered. When Melinda was later asked by CBS anchor Gayle King whether Bill Gates had cheated more than once, her answer was careful and telling. She said that was something Bill needed to answer himself. Yet even those allegations, serious as they were, did not appear to be the breaking point. What troubled Melinda Gates most, according to multiple reports, was her husband's association with Jeffrey Epstein, a man she said she met only once, a man she later described as abhorrent, a man she said was evil personified. Despite Epstein's prior conviction for soliciting prostitution from a minor and his status as a registered sex offender, Gates met with him multiple times beginning in 2011, years after Epstein's crimes were already public. At the time, Gates would later say, he believed Epstein's connections might help attract wealthy donors to global health initiatives. In hindsight, he admitted it was a mistake, a profound one, because once Epstein's name resurfaced, once his emails, associations, and communications were unsealed, the consequences rippled outward, and Bill Gates was no longer insulated from them. The carefully constructed image of the world's most benevolent billionaire was beginning to fracture, not because of one bad decision, but because too many questions were suddenly impossible to ignore. By the time Bill and Melinda Gates publicly announced the end of their marriage, the story had already moved far beyond a private breakup. It had become a referendum on trust, not just between two people, but between a public figure and the world that had elevated him. For years, Bill Gates' reputation had been built on rationality. He was the engineer billionaire, the man who believed every problem could be reduced to data, modeled, and solved. That mindset defined his work at Microsoft, and later, his approach to global health and philanthropy. But the qualities that made him effective in boardrooms and laboratories did not translate cleanly into personal judgment. As journalists began revisiting Gates's past, a pattern emerged, not of criminal behavior, but of boundary-blurring decisions that clashed sharply with the image he had cultivated. The first cracks appeared in reporting around Microsoft. In 2019, it emerged that Microsoft's board had quietly launched an internal investigation into an alleged affair Gates had with an employee nearly 20 years earlier. The relationship itself was not new information inside the company, but the decision to formally investigate it was significant. Corporate boards do not reopen old matters lightly, especially when they involve founders. Shortly after that investigation became public, Gates resigned from Microsoft's board. Officially, the move was framed as a shift in focus toward philanthropy. Unofficially, it raised questions about what else the board had learned and whether Gates's leadership had become a liability rather than an asset. Then came further reporting. According to multiple accounts, Gates had pursued women on more than one occasion in ways that made colleagues uncomfortable. In one instance, reported by the New York Times, he emailed an employee asking her to dinner, adding a sentence that would later circulate widely. "If this makes you uncomfortable, pretend it never happened." To some, it sounded awkward. To others, it sounded inappropriate. What mattered was not how the recipient reacted, but how it reflected on Gates's understanding of power dynamics. He was not just another coworker. He was the founder, the boss, the man whose influence shaped careers. When Melinda Gates was asked directly whether Bill had cheated more than once, her response was measured but revealing. She declined to answer, saying it was something Bill himself needed to address. That hesitation spoke volumes. But even these revelations did not fully explain why Melinda ultimately chose to leave not only the marriage, but also the foundation they had built together. According to multiple reports, the most troubling issue for her was Bill Gates' relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. This was not a rumor or a single meeting. Investigations later confirmed that Gates met with Epstein on multiple occasions beginning in 2011, years after Epstein had already pleaded guilty to soliciting prostitution from a minor and was required to register as a sex offender. Melinda Gates met Epstein once. She later said she immediately felt uneasy and described him as abhorrent and evil personified. That discomfort did not fade. It grew. What made the situation more alarming was not just the meetings themselves, but their context. According to reporting, Epstein hosted Gates at his Manhattan townhouse. During meetings with members of the Gates Foundation team, Epstein reportedly attempted to downplay his own crimes, once comparing them to stealing a bagel. For Melinda, this was unacceptable. She reportedly warned Bill repeatedly to cut ties with Epstein. He did not, at least not immediately. Gates later admitted publicly that meeting Epstein was a mistake, but his explanations raised as many questions as they answered. He said he believed Epstein's connections to wealthy individuals could potentially help attract donors to global health initiatives. That rationale failed to convince many observers. By that point, Epstein was not a mysterious financier. He was a convicted sex offender whose reputation was widely known. Associating with him carried moral and reputational risks that should have been obvious. And then, years later, those risks materialized in the most damaging way possible. When millions of pages of Epstein-related documents were unsealed, Gates' name appeared among many powerful figures mentioned in Epstein's communications. Most of those mentions did not allege crimes, but they revealed proximity, access, familiarity. One set of emails in particular drew intense attention. In messages Epstein drafted to himself in 2013, emails that were never sent, he claimed that Gates had engaged in affairs, slept with young women from Russia, contracted a sexually transmitted infection, and sought Epstein's help in obtaining antibiotics to secretly give to Melinda. The language was graphic, personal, shocking. Gates denied the claims. His representative stated that the email was false and that Epstein was known to exaggerate, manipulate, and fabricate stories, often to inflate his own importance or exert leverage over others. Even Melinda Gates publicly dismissed the email's contents, saying she did not know Epstein's motives, but emphasized that every minute spent with him was something she regretted. The problem, however, was not just whether the claims were true. It was that Epstein believed he could write them at all. That alone suggested a level of familiarity and confidence that deeply unsettled the public. By this point, Gates's carefully curated image was unraveling from multiple directions at once. His marriage was over. His foundation was no longer a joint effort. His past associations were being re-examined line by line, and the narrative had shifted. Bill Gates was no longer simply the benevolent billionaire whose flaws were eccentricities. He had become a case study in how immense power intellectual confidence and moral blind spots can coexist, sometimes dangerously so. For Melinda Gates, the reckoning was personal. In interviews, she made it clear that whatever questions remained about Epstein, about Bill's behavior, about private decisions made in the shadows, those were not hers to answer. They belonged to him. And for the public, a different reckoning had begun. How much weight should philanthropy carry when judging a person's legacy? Can extraordinary good offset deeply troubling choices? And what happens when the man celebrated for saving lives is forced to answer questions about the company he kept when no one was watching? Those questions would only grow louder. As the Epstein documents continued to surface, the conversation around Bill Gates shifted in a subtle but decisive way. This was no longer just about a controversial association or a failed marriage. It became a broader examination of how power operates when it is concentrated in the hands of a few, and how easily accountability can blur when influence grows too large. The release of millions of pages tied to Jeffrey Epstein did not suddenly prove wrongdoing by every name mentioned, but it did something equally damaging. It shattered plausible deniability. The public was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Epstein was not operating on the fringes of elite society. He was embedded within it. And Bill Gates was one of many powerful figures whose proximity to Epstein raised difficult questions. Gates' defenders were quick to emphasize an important point. Being mentioned in Epstein's files does not equal criminal guilt. Epstein had a long history of exaggeration, manipulation, and self-mythologizing. He often portrayed himself as far more influential than he actually was, especially in private writings. But critics countered with a different concern. Why was Epstein given access at all? By 2011, Epstein's conviction was not a secret. His status as a registered sex offender was public record. For someone as risk-aware as Gates, someone who prided himself on calculating second and third-order consequences, the decision to engage with Epstein looked less like oversight and more like hubris. That perception was amplified by the explanation Gates offered. He said he met with Epstein because Epstein claimed to have connections to wealthy donors interested in global health and philanthropy. In other words, Gates believed the potential upside for his charitable work outweighed the reputational risk. To many observers, that logic revealed a troubling blind spot. It suggested that Gates viewed moral risk as something that could be managed or tolerated in service of larger goals. That may be a common mindset among powerful people, but seeing it applied so casually unsettled the public, especially when the cost of that calculation was borne by others. As scrutiny intensified, Gates's public responses grew increasingly constrained. He expressed regret. He called the meetings a mistake. He emphasized that nothing productive came from them. But he did not, and perhaps could not, offer a satisfying explanation for why they happened in the first place. That ambiguity became fertile ground for mistrust. In moments like this, reputation doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes. Each unanswered question becomes a crack. Each half explanation widens it. And over time, the structure begins to fail under its own weight. The pandemic had already transformed Gates into a lightning rod. His prominence in global health discussions made him a symbol, not just of philanthropy, but of elite influence itself. To supporters, he was a rational actor guided by evidence. To critics, he represented unelected power shaping public outcomes. The Epstein revelations landed in that context. They did not create skepticism, they confirmed it. Suddenly, every past decision was reinterpreted through a harsher lens. Gates' warnings about pandemics, his advocacy for vaccines, his role in global health funding, all of it was reframed by critics as proof that too much authority had been ceded to a private individual. Even those who rejected conspiracy theories found themselves grappling with a deeper issue: trust. Trust is not built solely on good outcomes. It is built on perceived integrity. And integrity is measured most sharply in private moments, in the choices made when no one is watching and when there is nothing to gain publicly. For Melinda Gates, that distinction mattered profoundly. In interviews after the divorce, she drew a clear line. She spoke compassionately about the victims connected to Epstein. She emphasized that no woman or girl should ever be placed in such situations. And she made it clear that whatever questions remained about Epstein and her ex-husband's conduct were not hers to answer. That boundary was telling. It suggested not just disagreement, but disillusionment. Melinda had spent decades helping build Gates's philanthropic legacy. She had stood beside him as the foundation became one of the most powerful institutions in global health. Walking away from it was not a symbolic act. It was a substantive one. And it reinforced the sense that the divorce was not merely personal, it was philosophical. For the public, the reckoning was slower but broader. Bill Gates had long benefited from a narrative of exceptionalism. He was seen as different from other billionaires, more thoughtful, more restrained, more moral. His awkward demeanor and data-driven style reinforced that perception. He did not look like a villain. He looked like a nerd who wanted to fix the world. The Epstein Association punctured that story. It suggested that Gates was not immune to the same temptations and compromises that define elite power everywhere else. That he, too, operated within networks where influence mattered more than appearances, and where moral lines could blur when stakes were high enough. None of this erased the tangible good his philanthropy had achieved. Millions of lives have been affected by programs funded through his foundation. Diseases have been fought, systems improved. That record is real. But legacy is not a ledger where good deeds automatically cancel out bad choices. It is a narrative, and narratives are shaped by trust. Once trust is damaged, every action is reinterpreted. Silence becomes suspicious. Caution looks like evasion. Regret sounds like public relations. By the early 2020s, Bill Gates found himself in an unfamiliar position. For the first time in his public life, he was no longer controlling the frame. The questions were no longer about what he planned to solve next. They were about who he had been when he thought no one would ever ask. And that shift, from admired problem solver to contested figure, marked a turning point. Not just for Gates, but for how society thinks about power, philanthropy, and the stories we tell ourselves about good billionaires. By the time the Epstein files entered the public conversation, something irreversible had already happened to Bill Gates's legacy. Not because a single document proved a single crime, but because the image that had once seemed so solid no longer felt complete. For years, Gates had occupied a rare moral position in public life. He was wealthy beyond comprehension, yet widely believed to be principled, powerful, yet framed as self-restraining. His philanthropy wasn't performative in the traditional sense. It was systematic, data-driven, and global in scope. He didn't just donate money, he built institutions. That distinction mattered. It's why the fall, or even the wobble, hit harder. When reputations are built on achievement alone, they can survive scandal. But when reputations are built on virtue, scrutiny cuts deeper. Every inconsistency feels like a betrayal of the story itself. And that is what ultimately changed with Gates. The Epstein connection, the resurfaced allegations, the divorce, the internal investigations. None of these existed in isolation. Together, they reframed a narrative that had gone largely unquestioned for decades. The story was no longer about a visionary solving problems humanity had failed to address. It became a story about how power insulates decision-making, and how even well-intentioned people can convince themselves that certain lines don't apply to them. This is where the public reckoning truly landed, because most people were not asking whether Bill Gates had done more good than harm. By almost any measurable metric, his philanthropic impact remains enormous. Lives were saved, diseases were pushed back, entire health systems were strengthened. The harder question was different. How much moral credit should extraordinary good buy? Is philanthropy a shield A counterweight? Or simply a parallel track that does not absolve private behavior? In the modern era, this question keeps repeating, not just with Gates, but with powerful figures across technology, finance, politics, and media. We celebrate outcomes, then struggle to reconcile them with the methods and compromises used to achieve them. Gates defenders argue that no individual should be reduced to their worst associations, that Epstein manipulated many people, that regret matters, that context matters. And those arguments are not unreasonable. But critics respond with something just as difficult to dismiss. Judgment matters most when the risks are obvious. Epstein was not a hidden predator by the time Gates met him. His conviction was public. His reputation was known. Continuing the relationship was not ignorance. It was a choice. And choices are the raw material of legacy. For Melinda Gates, that realization appears to have been decisive. Her departure from the marriage, and later from the foundation, was not accompanied by public accusations or dramatic revelations. Instead, it was marked by restraint. She spoke about trust, about health, about knowing when something is no longer sustainable. And she made one thing clear: the unresolved questions surrounding Epstein and her ex-husband's role in that world were not hers to carry. That quiet separation spoke louder than any press conference. It suggested that even within the most powerful partnerships, there are limits. Lines that once crossed cannot be uncrossed by good intentions or future plans. As for Gates himself, his public posture shifted. Fewer interviews, more caution. Regret stated plainly, but not elaborated. An acknowledgement that the dinners were a mistake,